that makes you uncomfortable, feel free to drop now, but want to make sure that we can post this for those who can't make it today. So should be getting that notification popping up right about now. Perfect. Okay, great. I think you can already see my screen. Just one more quick confirmation from someone would be great. Perfect. Okay, so have actually quite a bit of updates to cover today. But first, I'll do a quick introduction. So if you're new to the office hours, welcome. My name is Kendall Roden. I'm a cloud native global black belt at Microsoft, technical specialist on the team. I'm also a co-host on the Azure podcast. So if you're interested in just learning more about general Azure services, we try to host about an episode a week, and we've started doing videos as well. So feel free to connect with me, via Twitter or LinkedIn if you're interested in that. And then obviously really passionate about Kubernetes and the open source community. Actually wanted to do a quick call out here. So I've been a release shadow for the past 3 release cycles for the upstream project, and the applications are currently open for shadowing the next release. So if you're interested in kind of understanding how it works to run an open source project and be involved in that process, they have a bunch of sub teams that you can participate in. So I highly recommend doing that. I think the application is open until the 16th. And typically if you just pop it in Bing or in Google and search for the Kubernetes upstream release team, I think it'll pop up on Reddit or one of the other sources. And then Dave is one of my colleagues. He wrote a book. If you don't know this, we kind of tease him about it. But yeah, he wrote a best practices book about Kubernetes. And since he's not on the call, I'll give him a little bit of grief for that. But he's not able to make it today, so he'll typically be running these with me. So we basically created these calls with a couple of goals, really just to connect to the community directly, to talk more about AKS issues, blockers, things that are working well, things that aren't working well, and to hear feedback directly from all of you. And so I think it's been successful so far. We've been doing it for a while at this point, but always open to feedback. So just keep that in mind moving forward. We'd love to hear from you, things that you want to hear about on the call. Always feel free to drop those in the chat. We try to be as attentive as possible. Another quick ask, I know that it's tempting to come off mute or it can happen accidentally. So please just do a quick check to make sure you're on mute right now, just so we have the best possible audio quality. Thanks. So today what we're going to cover, just a few ecosystem updates, and by a few I mean I actually have some good ones. I'll drop all of the links to all of the resources in the chat so that you can look at them directly. And then we'll talk about Bridge to Kubernetes. So if you're familiar with Azure Dev Spaces in the past, Bridge to Kubernetes is kind of something that's evolved from Azure Dev Spaces. So I won't talk too much on it, but I'll let Nick and Lorenzo, cover that in their time on the call. And then we'll open it up to any questions or feedback, comments. And yes, the links will be posted in the chat window. And then once again, everything is managed through that GitHub repo that I think I've linked probably a million times on this call, but I'll do it again. And keep in mind, we will have the AKS product group on every other month to do a roadmap update. So that should be coming up within the next couple of calls. So quick things on AKS. So a big one is the deprecation of 117 happened on the 31st. So just keep that in mind, right? We're no longer going to be supporting, AKS when you're provisioning a 117 cluster. So if you're running that, I would recommend doing an update or an upgrade to make sure that you're on the latest possible version. We're on a more recent version than 117. Another CSI drivers are now going to be default as of Kubernetes 121 and above. So just keep in mind that's really that basically storage driver that allows you to natively integrate your cluster with things like Azure Disks and Azure Files. So that CSI driver will now be the default moving forward. And then I know we've talked about this a lot, and it's been in the release notes for I don't even know how many releases at this point. But PSP or pod security policy is being deprecated in the upstream project. And their deprecation schedule looked a little bit different than the initial AKS deprecation schedule. So we've actually changed our deprecation schedule to align with the upstream project. So the initial deprecation was in June, but now what we're basically saying is it's deprecated as of 121, but won't actually be removed until 125. And so just keep in mind, remember pod security policy, a lot of those features are going to be baked into Azure policies. So it's not necessarily, okay, you came here, okay. Sorry, I saw the audio issues and wanted to make sure I hadn't lost anybody. But just keep in mind, the functionality in pod security policy isn't going away. It's just being migrated or I would say, the successor of that would be using Azure Policy to implement some of the same functionality that you would have gotten in pod security policy. Another super exciting announcement is Open Service Mesh for AKS is now in public preview. So what that means is when you're in the process of provisioning your cluster, you can essentially just enable this add-on functionality similar to a lot of the add-ons on AKS that allows you to deploy the service mesh in a managed sense onto your AKS cluster. So if you're not familiar with Open Service Mesh, I think it would be great for us to do a session on this. So I'm going to put in the chat window OSM session. If you're genuinely interested in that, please like it. If you're not, don't like it. So would love to bring on somebody from the PG to talk about a little bit more about Open Service Mesh. But just keep in mind, if you're not already using, Istio, Linkerd, if you're not necessarily using Dapper, but maybe like how it had some of the service mesh functionality, OSM will meet a lot of the needs that a service mesh will meet for you. It's not necessarily going to be as fully fledged as an Istio, but it'll have all the things you would expect from a baseline service mesh, things like traffic shifting, splitting, MTLS, access control, all that good stuff. What's interesting about it is it's built directly on top of Envoy, the open source CNCF project. It's also an open source project, even though it's being driven by Microsoft primarily. And then it does implement the SMI, or the service mesh interface. And the goal of that really is to make sure that all of the service meshes are implementing a common interface for interoperability and flexibility, so on and so forth. And so great preview documentation, great demo, content if you're looking to kind of play around with it and just see what it can provide. Will Calico only be upgraded for 3.17 for Linux? Any G on when it'll get to 3.18? I'm not 100% sure, but I'll check in on that with you or for you, and then I'll try to get you a response by the end of the call. So ecosystem updates, once again, I know I've harped on this past couple of calls, but KubeCon, Cloud Native Con EU coming up basically in, I guess, a month now, and it's only $75. The keynotes are free, but there is going to be a secret source CSI driver session that is being presented by some folks over at Microsoft. So highly recommend checking that out if you are going to attend. And that's just a really good way to be able to securely access secrets into your Kubernetes cluster. And, that's agnostic of it running in Azure or another cloud provider. March 18th, super exciting. We have someone off mute. I think I can see them and mute them really quickly. Perfect. So on March 18th, a formal proposal was submitted for Dapper to become an incubation stage project in CNCF. I personally am super excited about this. I know we just did a talk on this last session, but that'll be really exciting because really the evolution of projects under the CNCF helps make sure they have the proper governance, security, all of that in place. So you get a lot more confidence that you're using an open source project when it has this structure around it, similar to how Kubernetes obviously does. Another really exciting thing within that is the Open Policy Agent graduated or reached graduation status. If you're not familiar with the Open Policy Agent, basically it integrates into a gatekeeper for Kubernetes. So when we think like admission control or admission policy, making sure that, hey, I only want to use an image from a trusted registry, or I don't want any YAML that doesn't have a set annotation, you're able to enforce that policy using gatekeeper. And that's actually what Azure Policy is now built on. So Open Policy Agent, really exciting project, and how that kind of the flavor or implementation of that for Kubernetes is definitely really powerful and something that we're working on further integrating into Azure. And then Flux, if you're familiar with the GitOps approach, Flux has now been voted to move from sandbox to incubating. So that just means basically it's going up a level in terms of its progression and support in the CNCF. And then the last thing I wanted to call out is that the KubeCon and Cloud Native Con for North America is going to be in October. And formerly the CFP, or the call for proposals, was April 11th, but they've moved that out to May. But if you're interested in maybe speaking at KubeCon, start thinking about that now, because basically you need to come up with your proposal and submit that by next month. Couple more things, and I'll pass it over to our friends here. I had somebody reach out to me, Robert, if I could make an announcement about this, so wanted to make sure I called it out. So there's going to be a GitOps Con, which is going to be like a day 0 event at the KubeCon event. And so just think of those as kind of being that one day or half a day sessions to really dig deep on a particular subject. And so GitOpsCon, this is the first one they've ever done, and they're looking for people who are interested in speaking. So you can submit there for the next, I guess, 2 weeks almost. So definitely consider either attending as a day zero event or proposing, something to speak about. And then in conjunction with that, this is an unrelated event, but also really exciting. There's going to be a GitOps Summit. It's totally virtual, hosted by the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, and it's happening in June. So if you're interested, it's just a single day event, but I feel like, giving people a heads up now is more beneficial, because then you can actually block the time. Another update, this is really more for myself on the GVB side, but my teammate Ray and I, over the next 3 weeks, will be doing an AKS web series, basically all focused on kind of fundamental configuring your cluster with confidence, then really optimizing from a security perspective. We're going to talk a lot about, should I use availability zones and what does that bring into the table? Why should I use managed identity versus maybe the traditional service principal approach? So we're really going to talk about the why behind some of the best practices we recommend to customers. And then the last day will be a lot around kind of Kata, Dapper, Helm, and how to make use of some of these open source projects on top of your cluster. So I'll put a link in there, but yeah, definitely send this out. If there's people in your organization maybe that are less Kubernetes savvy, this would be great for them. And if you're maybe 200 level looking to go to 300 or so, I think this will definitely get you there. And then the last resources, once again, all these will be posted in the chat, are just some really cool things I've come across. So there's a girl named Anise, and she does 100 days of Kubernetes videos, and they're actually really cool. And so I'll link her videos, but she also has this really comprehensive basically website where she posts all of the links she uses to learn about Kubernetes. So I'll post that just because I think anytime we can find additional resources that are helpful is good. There was a great speech by Cheryl Hung of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. She's basically the VP of ecosystem, and she does a keynote on like the 10, all the links will be in the chat window, I promise. She'll post 10 predictions, or she spoke about 10 predictions for Cloud Native this year. And so I think that's a great thing just to keep a pulse on, where do we see things moving? And then there's a great article, I have not read it, but my team has had this crazy long email thread about this article called Cloud Native is about culture, not containers. And it basically just talks about how sometimes we've over pivoted on, saying that Cloud Native means microservices, it means containers. And the reality is that's not always the best fit for a workload. And you can still do Cloud Native well without necessarily adopting all of these Cloud Native, requirements per se. And so I think this is a great article. Maybe we can have a quick discussion about it on the next call, because I personally still need to read through all of it. It's pretty lengthy, but wanted to link that here. So once again, once I stop sharing and pass it over, I will post all of the links. So this is all I had. I'm going to pass it over to, I believe Nick might be kicking it off. So Nick, if you just want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about, Bridge to Kubernetes, what we should expect for the session, and then take it from there. So thanks, everyone.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kendall. Let me share the screen. Okay, can everyone see my screen? It should be a presentation slide.
Yep.
Cool. All right, well, thank you for joining the call today. My name is Nick Greenfield, and I'm a program manager on the Bridge to Kubernetes team. And I'm joined today with Lorenzo, who's a software engineer on the team. And so just to give an agenda of what we'll be talking about today, I'll start off by talking about Bridge to Kubernetes, a high-level overview, and some of the value props that Bridge to Kubernetes has, how it works. So we'll look at it from an architectural standpoint. We'll actually see it in action through a demo. And then for those that are already familiar with Bridge to Kubernetes and have seen recent talks or conferences where we were present, we'll talk about some of the recent feature updates that we've released over the past couple months, and then our look ahead plans, really our roadmap as we move forward. And then we can always spend some time at the end if there's any questions to address. So getting right into it. What is Bridge to Kubernetes? Well, Bridge to Kubernetes is a development tool that's targeted towards development teams that are authoring microservice applications that target Kubernetes. And so what Bridge to Kubernetes provides is the ability to debug and test code changes in your microservice code, but in the context of the larger application. And so for those that are familiar with Dev Spaces, this is pretty much the same value prop, but with a different working solution. And so What we've learned from Dev Spaces is that the solution of having to change code and continuously sync and test that code in the cluster added some extra friction to a developer inner loop. And so Bridge to Kubernetes, again, with the same value prop, achieves that with a different solution of allowing the developer to run and debug microservice code on their dev workstation, but by filling external dependencies and other upstream services by connecting to a Kubernetes cluster, a deployed environment where the rest of the application is running and those other services are present. And so it's it's also a lighter weight solution from Dev Spaces. It's very much a client-side tool that has deep integration into Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code through the extension marketplace. That is where you can find Bridge. And so I kind of want to just jump into how Bridge works and then talk about some key highlights that you get from using Bridge. So I'm showing just a simple microservice architected app. This is a to-do application. It's actually the sample app that if you were to get started with Bridge to Kubernetes today, that you would find yourself working through in our quick starts. And so this app allows me to add items on a to-do list, check them off, see stats, how many I've completed, how many I have remaining. And so, yeah, I have this deployed to an AKS cluster. It's pretty simple, couple backend APIs that sit behind a front end. There's a queue with a worker reading from that queue and writing into a Redis cache. And so as a developer or someone that owns, it's part of this project, let's say primarily focused on one of the backend services, how do I develop this service, right, confidently knowing that my code changes will work in the context of the entire app, right? And so we know there's a lot of different approaches out there today that allow you to achieve that. And so, what we've heard is we kind of broken down in 3 different buckets, right? There's the a local approach where I can actually spin up the entire application graph on my dev box, right? Whether I'm running everything natively and wiring up my services and dependencies manually or using systems like Docker Compose. Which is really great for a developer inner loop, quick feedback, iterative style. But what we've heard is that it lacks in fidelity. And so at your dev machine is going to be vastly different from where this application is deployed to. And then so the extreme of the local approach is the remote approach. And this is kind of where Dev Spaces was falling in, where I'm actually iterating on my code locally, but then deploying that code into some deployed environment, into the cluster, and then testing those changes and debugging in the cluster itself. And so this really does provide that strong high fidelity to a production-like system, but it does lack in that the speed in which your developer inner loop is greatly slowed down, where now you're having to containerize your code and deploy your code, and it requires those additional concepts of having to understand Kubernetes deployments that we know not all developers are experts in. And so Bridge to Kubernetes kind of bridges that gap, no pun intended, between that local and remote approach. It's really much a hybrid approach where I, as a developer, can work on a microservice on my dev machine or a subset of microservices on my dev machine, but connect to a deployed environment, so a Kubernetes cluster, to fulfill my dependencies and external services so that I can iterate on my code, but I'm doing that in an end-to-end fashion. And so to take a look at what that really means, we'll walk through this here. And so as a dev that wants to work on this stats API, the first thing that I would have to do is open up this project in either Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. And it just needs to have that one source code for that one service. Nothing else is required. And so when I have that open, I would then install the Bridge to Kubernetes extension that you can find in the marketplaces. And once you have that extension installed, you're ready to start using Bridge. And what you would do is you would define the connection. This is like a one-time configuration that you would set up and it's persisted that allows you to persist how your dev machine communicates and creates this connection bridge to your Kubernetes cluster. And so once that connection is made between your dev machine and your Kubernetes cluster, you specify a service that you want to overtake. So in this case, since I have the stats API open, I'm going to tell Bridge, which is going to tell my cluster, that that's the service that I want to replace with my own locally running version. And so what Bridge to Kubernetes will do is actually swap out that service with our agent that's responsible for redirecting traffic to that service to the locally running version on my machine. so that when traffic going in through the front end entry point of my app running up in AKS, so in this case, the front end running in AKS, and eventually calls that stats API, makes a request to that service, it's reverse proxied to my locally running version where my code changes are executed, my debugger breakpoints are hit, and then seamlessly sent back into the cluster for that request to be completed. So this is just a really high level overview of how Bridge works. And when you want to call out, or we want to call out specific highlights of what this actually provides you as a developer and a development team is, one, it really simplifies microservice development. So one of my favorite things about Bridge is that it eliminates the need to have to manually source and configure my dependencies in the other services. So how other services call the service that I'm working on, and then how my service calls other services, the dependent services. It's very much as if my machine was dropped into the cluster and I'm working in that environment. So you get that for free from using Bridge. It allows you to develop your apps faster. So as mentioned, there's no requirement to have to containerize your code or deploy your code into some environment. You're very much just running your code natively. So that was a stats API written in Node. I just use npm run and it's up and running, and I can redirect traffic to that running service on my machine. Debug and testing end to end. So by forwarding traffic from the cluster to my machine and back, it gives me that end to end workflow. And then lastly, it allows me to work in isolation. So this is something that wasn't shown in the last diagram, which I'll talk about in a second. But for development teams that are working in a shared environment, this is really handy. If you in that last slide, if other developers are working in that namespace, right, traffic is going to be rerouted to my machine and vice versa. My traffic will be routed to their machines and their services on their machine. And so we don't want that developer overlap. So Bridge to Kubernetes has this isolation mode where I can specify certain requests to be redirected to my machine. So only traffic that I'm initiating will hit and execute on my service running locally, and vice versa for other developers that are working in that namespace. And so what that looks like, going back to our architecture diagram here, is you would follow the same flow. You have the extension, you create the bridge to your cluster, but during that configuration, you would actually say, I want to work in isolation. And so instead of swapping out the running service, we'll actually spin up our agent in parallel to the service that you've specified to work on. And so that bridge will give you a specialized URL. So in this case, we'll add a prefix based on your username of your machine to your application's URL. And so only traffic using that URL will know to actually hit the agent and then be reverse proxied to your locally running version. Whereas someone else that's working in this namespace might have their own URL. And so it knows to only send that traffic to their machine or just to hit the actual running service that's running in the cluster, not the agent. So with that, let's actually show a demo of this in practice. So I believe Lorenzo is going to take over the screen and show this exact scenario, but on a live application.
Yep. Can everybody hear me and see the screen? All good? All right. So let's see what actually the to-do application looks like. It's a really simple to-do application, and I can just add tasks.
So sorry to interrupt you. Am I the only one experiencing technical issues? I just want to make sure it's just me because I can't see your screen.
You cannot see my screen?
I can see it.
Okay, y'all can see it.
I can see it. Okay.
All right. So it's just a to-do application. I can add task and look at the stats. I just created one task and here we are. So let's say, going back to what Nick was showing before, actually, let me show you something else. So if I go and see all my services, these are all the components that Nick was showing before in the application diagram architecture. And so let's say that I want to debug the stats API. So now in code, I open the stats API code here. And as you can see, it's just the simple service code. Is a JavaScript node application, msserver.js. I don't have any Docker file. I don't have any compose YAML Kubernetes asset, nothing. It's just a simple application. And so let's go. If I try to run it as is, you can see I have my run script dev is present in my launch.json as the standard node application. The application tries to run, but then it fails. Why is that? Well, because it depends on all the other services running in the Kubernetes cluster. And if I run it natively in my box, I don't even get the environment set with the Redis cache connection string. So now let's try to use Bridge. By the way, Bridge is just an extension in VS Code. We have also for VS. You can just install it, and once you have it, you also have this nice bottom bar here. It also shows you your endpoints and whatnot, so it's really handy. But anyway, let's go ahead and use Bridge to debug this application. So F1, configure Bridge. So the first step of this wizard is to select what is your target service, like what is this source code about. And in our case, it's the stats API. We need to provide what is the port that the service is going to use when running locally, right? Because usually your service might be exposing port 80 when running in the cluster, and then in this case, it's exposed port 3001 when running locally. And then if you do have the launch settings, you can select it, because basically what Bridge is going to do is just going to clone it and add some Kubernetes sauce around it. Or if you don't have it, you can create one, or you can even do a connection without any launch profile, and then you will be in charge of running your own application from the terminal once you're ready. In this case, we're going to use the dev one. And then here is what Nick was referring before. Like, you can just replace the specific instance of the service that is already running, or you can work in isolation, deploying the agent side by side, and then using the URL prefix, in this case would be Lodi -do this one, to route your request to that specific instance, while your colleagues will be free to use whatever was there already without being bothered by you. So let's work in isolation for now. So what this did was, in the launch.json, it created a new entry. Is now is the same as the previous one, run script, but now is with Kubernetes. So let's try this one. So I just go here, pick it, and start it. What this do is establish the connection between your local machine and the cluster. So as Nick was mentioning before, it will be like your machine being in the cluster. All the traffic that was going to reach your service in the cluster is now reaching your machine, and every dependency that you need to satisfy from your machine is going to be forwarded to the cluster, and you will be able to reach the services there. Also, we will be recreating all the environment that your application was seeing when running containerized in the cluster locally. So as you can see, there is no more the error because we didn't have the connection string for Redis. It's now listening on port 3001. So I just put a breakpoint on the stats endpoint in my server.js. But remember, we are running isolated. So now if I open again my application and I go see stats, well, nothing happens because the traffic is reaching the normal application. But now let's open, by using these handy features, let's open the isolated version of this. And now I still see the same data because the Redis cache and all the persistent state is still the same. We didn't clone those. We only cloned the specific stats API service. But when I go and see stats, bang, I hit my breakpoint here because the request got forwarded to my machine that was running this service. And now I'm here. I can debug. So if I keep going, the thing keeps going. And so let's say that let's move this one here just to show you. Yeah. So now let's go back, and I can even in real time change this. And instead of returning created, let's return 42. Why not? Control save, and because it's an old application, I already changed the code. It's already running. So if I do a refresh, and I go to stats, breakpoint is hit again, and bang, SC42 here. This is my local code, that I reach though through the Kubernetes cluster. And they can keep changing and iterating my inner loop development without any problem, without having to do Docker build, Docker push, kubectl apply, add logging. How do I do remote debugging? I can just debug locally. And if I go back to the non-isolated one, it's still working as before. I don't see any 42 here. So now everybody in my team can have their own copy of their own services, do local debugging, local development, but test it in the context of the whole application running in a Kubernetes cluster. Is there any question about this? All right. So yeah, let me go.
Sorry, is that due to this bridge plugin we were able to debug it locally, pointing it to our local? I mean, that's how it is working. Sorry,
Yeah.
Lorenzo, I just joined a few minutes back. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so what we do with our bridge to Kubernetes extension in VS Code, it allows you to make a debug configuration where you specify which service you want to debug, which service running in the Kubernetes cluster you want to debug, and just by having, and basically what this does is it replaces the services running in the Kubernetes cluster with our agent, and then we have the traffic getting forwarded back and forth, and now your machine is like plugged into the cluster, so then you can run your code, and it will be reached when somebody reaches it from the cluster, and you can consume all the stuff that is running into the cluster.
Got you. And this would be a separate service will be running for us, or it's going to be the common service where other developers will also be using at this time?
So you can specify if you want isolation or not. In this case, we are running isolated. So for instance, if I run the default URL, everything is like normal. But if I prefix with my isolation string, then when I refresh, I have this other version that is actually hitting breakpoints, and I modify the code so it returns 42, for instance, just to differentiate. And yeah, so you will be debugging here while your team will still be seeing the normal version running side by side.
So how do we put that isolation, what are the parameter or what are the extension you passed in? Where are we passing that? I mean,
oh yeah, there is so basically there is a configuration step that you need to do with our extension where you select the service, you specify the local port that your service will be running on when debugging locally. If you have a launch profile, you can select it. So then when you start debugging, we will trigger it for you. And then here you specify if you want redirection or not. I said yes. So here we go. If you don't like to have this specific string, you can modify it. It's all transparent in task.json is where we define everything. So we say the local port is 3001 is a service named stats API in this cluster, in this namespace. And here is the isolation. So you can put whatever you want in here and it's still going to feed out of this. So
thank you.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Let me go back to the presentation here. You know, I need to swap screens. Here we go. So recently we introduced new feature in Braze. We support now local cluster like Minikube, any remote cluster. It doesn't need to be AKS. It can be any cloud provider. And also, if you have your own on-prem, you build your cluster, you can still use us with that. We do have integration with the VS Code Kubernetes extension. So then you can start the configuration process directly by selecting a workload in the Kubernetes extension. And also, you can select your context from there, the namespace. We added supported for managed identity and pod identity. We decouple bridge and debug. This was what I was showing before. Like if you don't have a debug profile already, you can just configure bridge and then you're in charge of starting the application the way you prefer with terminal and whatnot. Normally, bridge requires admin privileges because we author your host file for routing services, intercept traffic. But if that, we heard feedback from few customers that was an issue for them because their dev box was locked down and they didn't have admin privileges. If that's your case, there is a workaround using environment variables that we just introduced. If you need to debug multiple services at the same time, excuse me, you can do that. You can just start different session of VS Code or VS at the same time, have different connections going on, and debug all of them at the same time. Put breakpoints in service 1, another breakpoint in service 2, see what's going on. And also, like if normally in your dev cluster you have multiple replicas for one service, then we support it by just automatically downscaling it to 1 and then connecting to that single instance. So then you're always gonna hit your breakpoint when a request comes in. Features coming in the future. We want to support services running containerized locally. There are scenarios in which developers do not want to run their code natively because maybe Python is sometimes a little messy with environments and whatnot, and you would just want to run inside a container so it doesn't mess up your dev box. And there are debugger tools for local containerized workload anyway, so that's something that we're going to support. There is support for code spaces coming, also for Dapper. If you have a Dapper enabled cluster with Dapper sidecars, we are working to make it work with Bridge as well. Also, as of today, this works for services that are already there, but we want to also add support for new services. Let's say you are creating your application and you want to add a service. Well, now we will just deploy a brand new agent that allows you to reach all the other services locally and facilitating your development cycle. And also, as of today, Bridge is shipped as a VS Code extension and a Visual Studio extension, but we also want to provide a CLI to give you even more flexibility in the usage of that. Yeah, so open for questions now.
So yeah, Lorenzo, there are a couple in the chat window. One of them around the multi-container pods. Oh, it's multi-container pods. They weren't talking about multi. So do you know if that's on your roadmap? I was thinking they were talking about.
Yeah, that's also on our roadmap. We forgot to put it in the slide. So as of today, if your multi-container is because you do have a service mesh, like, yeah, you're running your application container and also you have Istio or Dapper or something else on the side, then we are smart enough to identify which is the right container. But going forward, we're going to surface in the extension itself a way for you to define what is the container that you need to be replaced with our agent, so that even if you have multiple application containers in the same pod, you can select which one you want to debug. It's coming. And what else?
Looks like there's a question about RBAC. So like what permissions on the cluster, the AKS cluster you might need if you're running with like RBAC enabled?
Yeah, so for now you will need admin on your namespace. I know it's a little wide, but that guarantees that we can do everything we need to do in there. Actually, this is a good question also for the crowd. Is this a problem to be admin on your namespace?
Hey, probably I can comment on that. That was my question. This is Vamsi. This is a great demo. Thanks, Lorenzo. Yeah, I think at least a couple of customers, right, giving an admin privileges at namespace specifically on the prod cluster is a problem. But I'm assuming that you anyways do this on a dev or one of those clusters, so it shouldn't be a problem. But just curious. Yeah,
this is meant mostly to be used on a dev cluster. You don't want to risk messing up things in prod. Yeah, so we just assume that because it's a dev cluster, I mean, we can assume that if a company is a little more strict, they can give like a one namespace per developer, and the developer will be admin on it, but locked out of everything else. And in that case, we still work. But if you are less than admin in your namespace, then it might have problem with that. Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions while we have the team just before we move forward? feedback, thoughts around it? Does it sound compelling? Just kind of curious to get feedback. We have a lot of people on the call, so if you have any thoughts to share, any feedback, or ask, this would be a good time to surface those up.
Yeah, absolutely. Is any of you planning to use it, to give it a try, give it a spin?
Yeah. So definitely trying, or looking forward to using it. It looks promising, and I think it addresses a common need that's in the Kubernetes developer sphere. I was just curious about when you run it in isolation. Do you alter the ingress route or the ingress rule on the fly?
Yes, we alter the ingress rules, and we also add services. So then when the request comes in, if it has the host prefix, then we also add a route as header at the request header, and then that is used to route between different services. So that if you have the route as header, it's going to go to the isolated instance. Otherwise, it's going to go through the normal path. And also, like, if you want routing to work everywhere, then also your services should support header pass-through. So then after the request goes through your, especially if you are debugging multiple services, and you have multiple copies of multiple services, and you want to follow the path, or wherever you have the Lodi copy goes to the Lodi copy, then the route as header needs to be propagated so that every request is going to be routed accordingly. But that works. I mean, as long as your code is propagating headers, then everything happens automatically.
Yeah. Okay, got it. So I think one thing that comes immediately in my mind is on the fly SSL certificate acquisition via Acme or something like that. If you register the subdomain on the fly, that may have some timing impact, up until the new subdomain actually gets a valid SSL certificate if you don't own the wildcard as certificate and have that in the cluster already in place.
Yeah, we did have, I didn't work directly on the HTTPS and certificates implementation around the routing scenario, the isolation one, but I know we do support it, at least for the most common configuration, but it was another colleague of mine that did it. I'm sorry, I don't have much context on what we are actually doing there.
Okay, cool. But I will definitely take a look at it. So thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, Lorenzo. I have one question. Does this support private AKS clusters?
Yes, it does. I believe. Yeah, it does.
We're working
yes.
on documentation for that currently, but it has been validated.
Great, thanks, guys.
I also have a couple. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Kendall. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I had a couple of questions that surfaced up just as I've been talking to customers. So one is support for other IDEs like IntelliJ. Is that something that you see on the roadmap? I actually think I did see it on the roadmap, but is that like a feasible, going to be within a certain time frame that you could share?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, it's we're hearing that request a little more recently, and so it is on our backlog. There is no ETA for that now, but that would be purely from a CLI perspective. Not that we wouldn't add actual extensions for these other IDEs at the moment. That could change in the future, but it would pretty much just a CLI that will allow you to use your dev tooling of choice. Perfect.
Okay, makes sense. And then another one was, okay, for example, between the two modes, the isolation mode and no, I want every other, everybody else's traffic to come to my machine. How are the other developers notified that they're now being routed to that person's instance? Like, how do I Kindle know that when I'm hitting, service A, that person has basically implemented the route all traffic to my service? Like, will I get notification of that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So as it is today, we don't have a notification system in place for that. We are just relying on the users being good citizens in their cluster. So if you're going to interrupt the flow because they're going to debug a specific service in the chain of calls, then or you use isolation or just deploy a copy of the application in your own namespace and play around in there.
Okay.
Those are the two options. Yeah, but
So,
if somebody in your team start hijacking your pod, well, the team's pod basically, then yeah, you can go there and ask what's going on. But I guess that's also what can happen every day in everyday development. Also, like if I go and mess up the cluster, then I mean that's my fault.
Yeah. Cool. That's all I had. Any last questions or thoughts that anybody has on this? Awesome. Okay.
But I'll just add one last thing. For any of those that do want to try out Bridge, and we'd love your feedback on how it went. So there's an email here that goes directly to our team. So for you, any questions or just nice to have feature requests, we're open to all of that. We're very much, our backlog is very much prioritized by customer requests and feedback. So yeah, we look forward to hearing from you.